Okay, Ron, we got to try some of this fudge here. We got some
yeah.
fudge here. You want to try some?
That looks delicious. Yeah.
Oh, it's really good. Every service, we got to have a little bit of fudge. It's really fun. We had like 15 fudges.
Wow.
Larry tasted every one. He got sick by the time he was done. They were all so good. But we selected 4 and every one. And we're having a little fun with the name, Oh Fudge, Sweet Lies That We Tell. So we have another kind of a focus of this. And it's really about marriage and our relationships. So let's give them a warm-up question.
Sure.
Everybody has to answer this now.
Right.
So, boy, can you even talk after that, Fudge?
Yeah, I got it down now. So
Okay. So what's the warm-up question?
Okay, the warm-up question is, I want you to think about someone you know or maybe you knew in the past who had a really great marriage. And then share with the group, what is it that you think makes a marriage great?
And before you come back, I want you to read 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 15, all the way through chapter 7, verse 17. It's a big passage and an interesting passage, so be ready to talk about it. So, Ron, this city, Corinth, we've just read this passage. It's obvious they have written a letter to Paul ahead of time, it seems like.
Right.
And there's a lot in this passage, kind of interesting, and it's going to be fun to talk about here, right?
Yeah.
And dig in. Can you set the scene before we have them think a little bit about the question? Let's set the scene. What's Corinth like? Let's help them figure out what they're reading and what it's like.
Yeah, Corinth was kind of like the sin city of the ancient world, and maybe in the first century.
Kind of San Francisco almost,
or
right?
maybe Las Vegas.
Las Vegas.
You might think of, they might have said, what happens in Corinth stays in Corinth, right? They had this big temple, lots of prostitutes, and so there was a lot of stuff going on there in that world that, a Jewish person would have known because they had a background in the law, but these weren't people who weren't necessarily Jewish people.
They had just come to Christ, and many of them, from all their different cultures, even different languages, came to Christ, said, I'm a follower of Christ. And they brought with them all the baggage of everything they'd been taught since they were a kid, right?
Yeah, sure.
So they come with these questions, and that really is the question we want them to think about, right?
Yeah, so, what we want you to do is think, if you lived in Corinth in that time, you were part of this new thing, new Christians, you might have some questions about marriage, about sex, about divorce. What kind of questions would you have? So why don't you share that with your group?
So Ron, as we look at this, we could kind of figure out what they were asking based on this. As you read the passage, you kind of get a little insight as to what questions they had when they sat around in a group, and all of them came with their culture. And what's your observations out of that? What helps you set?
Yeah, so in chapter 6, the last part of chapter 6, Paul's talking about prostitution. And I was thinking, where did that come from? Well, we see a little bit earlier that Paul quoted this saying they had, food for the stomach and the stomach for food. And that was just their way of saying, like, hey, if you're hungry, you eat, right?
Yeah.
So if you want sex, you have sex. You just, with whoever, you go down to the prostitute or whatever. That's just the way it was in their world. And a lot of people just thought, well, we don't see anything wrong with that. That's just the way it is.
So is that anything like our culture? What do you think? It's kind of interesting, isn't it?
What's amazing is the Greek word that's translated prostitute is the word porne, from which we get our word pornography, right? So in some ways, in our culture, there's maybe less the real prostitution and more virtual prostitution, if you could imagine that.
Wow. So, Paul's really addressing this issue, saying that you really, that's not correct. You just don't, you have this appetite, but you also have to control your appetite. There's got to be some control.
In fact, he says, he who sins sexually sins against his own body. And we just had a marriage seminar here at the church called Laugh Your Way Through Marriage, where we talked about this very thing. And one of the things we learned is that it's become a big problem in our culture, to the point where a lot of people have actually lost the ability to enjoy sex in marriage because they're so inundated in pornography.
And that really takes away the desire. And I think we were talking earlier, and there's this cultural phenomenon that's sexless marriage, right?
Yeah.
Because it's really not satisfying, and there's all kinds of problems with that. Now, we actually have a group in our church that deals with some of the sexual addictions that come out of that, right?
Right.
And we encourage you. In fact, we don't really make it a specific time or place. You can just ask us about it, and we'll tell you about it and
Sure.
how to be a part of that and do that. Now, we have a second question we want them to kind of focus in on here.
Right, right. So at the beginning of chapter 7, there is a question that Paul answered. And again, he is quoting one of the sayings they had. And so I want to know, what is that question they're asking behind this saying?
Okay, so think about that. We'll come back and talk about it. Okay, did I jump too far ahead?
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay, so we'll come back.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what's the saying? What do you think? I'm curious whether people got it or not.
Well, some translations actually say it's good for a man not to marry, which is not really the best translation. Another translation says it's good for a man not to touch a woman, and that's really a euphemism. What they were really saying was, you should not have sex.
Yeah. Which there's some out in our culture in the church world that thinks that sex is dirty, sex is bad, and that's not correct.
Right, and they were saying not just for single people, they were saying nobody should ever have sex, and which would be really bad for the kids program.
Yes, it wouldn't. It wouldn't help our marriage at all, right? Yeah. So his answer to that was what? I mean, just.
Yeah, well, that's actually the next question. So I want you to look at verses 2 through 6 and see what Paul's answer to this is.
Which is a great thought. Let's see how you come up with the answers too. Okay, Ron, so Paul digs in and he answers it. I actually think he's pretty brave when he digs into some of these topics, isn't he? He goes right at the heart of them and he talks. Yeah. I love the Bible. I think it's so clear. I mean, it makes these things clear, and he talks openly about it. So how do you sort through this?
Well, he says, first of all, it's a good thing. In marriage, it's a good thing.
Right.
And he actually describes it like it's a duty to your spouse, which is an interesting way to think of it. He talks about, a man does not have authority over his own body alone, and a woman doesn't alone. He's just saying, like, you're in this together. There's a duty to your spouse. It's recognizing that, maybe one partner is not necessarily in the same place as another one. And he says, if you do abstain temporarily for the purpose of prayer or whatever, do it if you agree and only for a short while. And so he's saying that he says this is a concession, not a command, which I don't like that translation. It makes it sound like, oh, well, if you have to, if you can't control yourself. But he's just saying he's not commanding people to abstain.
Right.
Right.
In fact, I think when he looks at this, I love the thought that he says it's good, and he encourages you. Really, it's a way for you to serve your spouse. Mm-hmm. It's a way for you to be a servant in your relationship. And I think it's the healthy way to look at sexuality, and that we need to be thinking about the other person instead of just ourselves.
Right.
In that whole process. Now, we're going to dig in a little bit deeper here in this next question.
So Paul talks to single people, which, there's lots of single people in our church. There was in that church as well. Mm-hmm. So maybe they're wondering, well, what's our place in this? So what does Paul say to single people?
Yeah. Okay, Ron, so single people stay single? Is that what you get out of that?
Yeah, that was actually Paul's advice. He says it's good for them to stay unmarried, but if they can't control themselves, get married. Right?
Which is kind of interesting because a lot of people don't know this. Paul was, from most people's opinion, was married and probably divorced or certainly separated. He was certainly estranged from his wife, because it says it's better to remain as I am, single. You know, he's really revealing a part of himself where he had learned to live singly and in a healthy relationship with God and with the world. And he's saying, hey, if you can do it, live like I'm living.
Yeah, because he was able to do some amazing things that you probably just couldn't do if you had the responsibility of husband and father. You know, he was able to tromp around the world on these mission trips and, you know, get beaten half to death and thrown in jail and shipwrecked. And, you know, he saw that as his privilege, and he knew that it's good. If you're unmarried, you can do those sorts of things.
I think there's another part of this too, Ron, that people may miss. They honestly thought that Jesus was coming back any day now. I mean, just any moment. And I think there was a sense to where, you know, we need to do as much as we can before he comes back. So if you can stay single and you can do more, then that's a good reason to do it. And so I don't think he's advising not to get married at all.
No, in fact, you know, he says it's better to get married than to have, you know, a continual struggle with immorality.
So that's a part of what he does. Now, Paul also dives into another topic, which is about divorce.
Yeah, touchy subject. And so, but it's in his day as well as ours. Let's look at verses 10 through 17 and see, what does Paul say about divorce?
All right, so what does he say? Kind of interesting.
Well, he says the bottom line is you should stay together if you possibly can.
Right.
Yeah. And in fact, some people were saying like, well, hey, I'm a new Christian and my spouse isn't. Should I get divorced? You know? And
it almost was easier, because when they became a Christian, they often were divorced, right? It happened because they were shunned or pushed aside or whatever.
Yeah, and he says, you know, if your spouse is willing to stick together, you should stay together.
Right, and it's really true. I love the thought that he said, God has made your home holy through you. Your presence, the presence of God comes into your household through you, and that's a powerful thought.
Yeah,
and that. And when I look at this whole passage on divorce, I think of the messy relationships that had to be in that Corinth church. We know there were a lot of them. And I think about many of our families that are here today. Some of you have been through all kinds of things in your life, and you come to Christ the way you are, and what he does is he takes us and he makes us whole again. We're broken people, but God, through our brokenness, begins to heal us and change us and make us better. And really that's the advice I think he's trying to say, is that do your best and give him your brokenness and let him heal you. Well, hopefully you've had a good time to discuss some of this. I think some of you may want to take a little bit of time to talk and maybe pray for each other's marriages and encourage each other along the way. So good time to share around your group. I encourage you to do that. And we'll see you next week at Connection Point Studies.